Weekend Whappers, welcome into tonight's ATW, where the topic is on two topics actually, and each of these two topics has quite a bit in common with each other, and that is going to be the spread of peoples via the ocean. We're going to play off of our Southeast Asia theme today by continuing the conversation with where we left off today in class. And that's looking at the growth of Southeast Asia, especially thanks to its proximity to water, and especially in the Indian Ocean trade routes that fueled the growth of all those important cities and empires in Southeast Asia. And I want to introduce a new term to you. And this is a term that last year my students really took a liking to, and they talked a lot about the importance of this term. We talked a lot about the importance of this term in class. And that term is one that's a little hard to pronounce, so bear with me and I'll bear with you throughout the year as we use this term. But the term is called a thelassocracy, a thelassocracy. And a thelassocracy is an empire that's built near the ocean. Basically, if you want to think of it, it's basically an empire at sea. And a lot of the Southeast Asian empires that I'm going to talk about today were examples of thelassocracies. Now, let's go back in time, because I want to remind you of some PSF. If we go back and look at one of the earliest thelassocracies, that would be the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were Mediterranean-based peoples who gifted the world one of the first alphabets, and the Phoenicians built themselves a thelassocracy in the Mediterranean region, an empire at sea, where they had trade routes and city-states that they conquered and brought into their empire. Well, in Southeast Asia, in the post-classical era, two important thelassocracies that we're going to talk about arose to power thanks to their prominence in the Indian Ocean trade routes and in Southeast Asia. And these were prominently powerful empires really in the post-classical era, so around the 700s to about the 1000s region, so right in the heart of our post-classical era. And the two that I want to talk about, the first is the Srivijaya Empire. And the Srivijaya Empire is a wonderful example of a thelassocracy. It's situated in modern-day Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, so it just gives you a modern-day geographical understanding. And the Srivijaya Empire became quite prominent thanks to their ability to trade and control their empire at sea, which meant that this thelassocracy in Southeast Asia was going to control the Straits of Malacca. That's something we talked about today, the location, location, location. So the Srivijaya Empire was right along the Straits of Malacca, and they controlled the Straits of Malacca, and that was the key to their empire building. Now, the Srivijaya Empire was most famous for two items that they traded a lot: gold and spices. Spices, we haven't really talked much about the importance of spices, but spices were a luxury good that Southeast Asia was plentiful with. And this is what drove lots of trade coming from all over the Indian Ocean to get these valuable spices. As a result of the spice trade and the gold trade, lots of cultural diffusion occurred. You had traders coming in from East Africa, China, India, Arabia. And so lots of cultural diffusion, lots of influence came from China, India, but also Islam. We can't ignore the fact that Islam spread heavily into the Srivijaya Empire as well, because of the fact that the Srivijaya Empire was in the Indian Ocean trade routes, and Islamic merchants so heavily dominated the Indian Ocean trade routes. So to repeat again, that's Islam had influence, China had influence, as well as India having heavy influence in this part of in this thelassocracy in Southeast Asia, the Srivijaya. Another empire that I want to talk about, another thelassocracy that rose to power. They were close to the Srivijaya Empire. They were actually their neighbors to the southeast. And this was the Sailendra Kingdom, or Sailendra Empire. This is another example of a thelassocracy, modern-day Indonesia, to be precise. And the Sailendra Kingdom, very similar to the Srivijaya Kingdom in that there was heavy influence in culture from China, from India, Islam again. And a good example of the cultural diffusion that occurred in the Selendra Empire was the Temple of Borobudur, the famous Buddhist temple that was built in the jungles of Java, Indonesia. And therein again is a perfect example of how Buddhist merchants and Buddhism spread down into parts of the Selendra Empire or Selendra Kingdom. So again, what we're really dealing with here are two important examples, two thalassocracies that I want you to have noted down, the Srivijaya and the Selendra Empire as well. We can add that to our discussion on Southeast Asia. And really, it's more importantly that term of thalassocracy that I want us to take away from this version of the ATW, this section of the ATW. So who are the Vikings? The Vikings were groups of northern Europeans. That's why they're sometimes called Norsemen. They're called Norsemen because they came from northern Europeans, so they were northern men. The Vikings came into world history in prominence really during the post-classical period following the fall of the Roman Empire. So we're talking 700s, 800s, 900s in that time period. And the Vikings kind of started off as nomadic seafaring peoples. They traveled from island to island in northern Europe, and I have some maps here to show you this. But the Vikings traveled all throughout northern Europe, and they kind of at first practiced hit-and-run style attacks all along various parts of northern Europe, as well as mainly the British islands that make up today Scotland and Britain and Ireland. And the Vikings would come to the coastline, they would raid villages, they would pillage, they would plunder, they would attack. But over time, this sort of hit-and-run style faded, and the Vikings began to spread into various parts of Europe once they attacked and conquered villages and towns. And so what starts to happen is an incredible collision of different culture mixing in Western and Northern Europe. You know, the Vikings were pagans or non-Christians, and when they influenced and hit various parts of Europe, as we've talked about before, most of Europe was under the influence of Christianity, whereas the Vikings were not. So that was a collision of culture right there in and of itself. The Vikings were not Christians, and so that created a lot of conflict. And as the Vikings would attack and hit various parts of Europe, sometimes, as I mentioned before, they would wind up settling in an area, and they would diffuse a lot of their Viking sort of culture. But that's an important point in and of itself. The Vikings didn't really have a unified culture. In fact, the Vikings weren't the same peoples. They were different groups of peoples that came from countries like Norway, Finland, Iceland, areas we would call today Scandinavia. That's kind of the region that the Vikings came from. But one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is they think that all Vikings were the same. But really, they were just various tribes that were moving in and out of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and even parts of Western Europe. And in a lot of ways, the Vikings are very similar to who we're going to talk about in class tomorrow, which are the Polynesians. So why did the Vikings move around? Well, very similar to the Polynesians, who you guys have been reading about. The Vikings moved around because, number one, most likely they ran out of resources. Number two, they were looking for places to conquer and settle down. But there really isn't like a solid known reason. There isn't like one reason why the Vikings moved. But we have to assume that because they moved around so seamlessly and so effectively through the water, the Vikings were expert. These groups of nomads were expert seamen. They traveled all over parts of Northern Europe, parts of Western Europe. And there's even a theory that some Viking groups went all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to North America and were some of the first peoples to hit the coasts of Newfoundland in Canada. Now that's never been proven definitively, but there is strong evidence to support that theory that some Vikings did travel across the Atlantic and become the first Europeans to get to North America. Either way, we have to take these people seriously because the Vikings eventually began to settle down in the regions of Western and Northern Europe and parts of Scandinavia, which they conquered, various cities and various territories. So we have to realize that ultimately over time, this sort of hit-and-run style, this sort of nomadic lifestyle faded. And really, by the 1100s, the Vikings were their attacking nomadic style was kind of over, and they became well assimilated into the various cultures of Western Europe and Northern Europe, where they eventually settled down. But the legacy of the Vikings will live on. The Vikings will always be remembered as fierce warriors, seamen, expert sailors in the frigid, cold northern Atlantic Ocean. But also, the Vikings and the Polynesians, who we're going to talk about tomorrow, share an awful lot in common in the way that they moved from location to location and ultimately settled down and diffused a lot of their unique culture to the areas that they settled in. So that's pretty much about it. I know I covered this very quickly, but the influence of the Vikings, as well as our Thelassocracies, there it is. I tripped up. I knew I got it through almost the entire ATW without one slip up on Thelassocracy, but then I got caught at the end. So anyways, I think it's a good time for me to sign out. As always, please make sure to bring questions tomorrow to class. I'm hoping to do an activity, but we've got to get through the Polynesian migrations tomorrow. So hopefully we'll have a good activity tomorrow if we have time. But otherwise, this is my reminder that, as always, the past shapes the future. I hope everyone enjoyed this video. Take care, Whappers, and have a great evening.